I gave a talk here on the Arab Spring about 3.5 years ago. I think some of you were there. I'm not sure the extent to which we agreed on what I had to say. But I think that what I said then pretty much remains what I believe now. And what has taken place in the last few years hasn't weakened the analysis I made then. In fact, I think it has reinforced it even more. So I won't, rehash what I said then, but more or less what I think I would be doing is the lecture I gave last time, phase 2. And what I would like to speak about as a result of that is, to ask the question, because I see the competing analytical paradigms, and this is what I spoke about last time, and I'll just recap very briefly, about what the Arab Spring really is or was. I think the conventional wisdom was and remains that the Arab Spring is a competition between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy in the Arab world. Not that that is untrue. It is true, and I think correct, but I don't think it's the main thrust of the debate. And I would argue that the main thrust of the debate is the competition between the forces of tradition and the forces of modernity. And I would argue that this is what you see in Egypt, this is what you see in Tunisia. In the last elections in Tunisia, it was the forces of modernity that came out on top, where it was the Islamists who won the last time. So it's a struggle between forces that in some places are more or less equal, and in other places somewhat less balanced. But I am quite convinced that this is the analytical prism that we ought to see it through. The forces of tradition or neo-tradition and the forces of modernity. And I'll say a word about what I mean when I say tradition or neo-tradition in a moment. And the question that I want to deal with here, and I will really try to keep my comments to within 30-35 minutes, so that we'll have some time for questions and other forms of assault. But the question I want to ask is, how do we explain the resilience of tradition? How come the forces of tradition, which are primarily three, political Islam, sectarianism, tribalism, how come these forces have been so resilient? And what I see in what it is that is before us in the last 3 or 4 years is essentially another round, another bout in this long 200 years of challenge and response between the forces of modernity and tradition. In the late 1950s, the renowned sociologist of the Middle East wrote what became quite a canonical book. Daniel Lerner wrote this book in the late 1950s and repeated editions in the early 1960s. Daniel Lerner's book was about the passing of traditional society. Modernizing the Middle East, it was called. And it did become a classic of sorts in Middle Eastern studies. But traditional society, I will argue, has not passed. And the Arab Spring has shown that critical characteristics of traditional society, such as the intimate association of religion and politics, or sectarianism, remain key facets of Middle Eastern societies, even if in different neo-traditional forms. The trinity of social theory, as someone called them, Durkheim, Marx, and Weber, all scientifically forecast the decline of religious belief as society is gradually modernized. Well, that is not the way things worked in the Middle East. And I will say in parenthesis here, I'm talking about the Arab countries in the main. But I will say in passing, although that's not the subject of my discussion, that in Israel too, the forces of tradition are far more resilient than people may have thought 50 years ago. Certainly far more resilient than the Zionists may have believed. The Zionists were great secularists for the most part, and really thought that they had a handle on the future, and that the forces of tradition, the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox religious Jews, were on their way out of history. Whereas the ultra-Orthodox always thought that the Zionists were a passing phenomenon, and they would outlast them in the long run. Well, it's an open debate. Much more now in Israel than it might have been 50 years ago. So this resilience of tradition is not only a factor of Arab politics, even though it's Arab politics that I'm talking about today. State secularism, that is secularism imposed by the state, in Middle Eastern societies has generally failed to produce secular societies. Where again, Tunisia is a kind of exception to the rule, where this is also state-imposed secularism. A secularism imposed by the dictatorships of Tunisia, from Bourguiba to Ben Ali, that has created a relatively secular society which has come out on top, I would say, in the secular religious clash in Tunisian politics since the revolution. But the point I'm making here is that culture matters. Culture matters. And those who argue that it doesn't, I think, are producing a prism which is analytically flawed. And I don't want to go into the reasons of why I think that argument has declined somewhat. I spoke about that last time. So we're talking about the resilience of tradition, which essentially means the continued importance of religion and piety. Societies that are religious and pious, not in their entirety, but in a very demonstrative, substantial way. Secular nationalism has been overrated, and the power and relevance of religion has been undervalued by Western Middle Eastern elites and by scholars and observers of the region for much of the 20th century. There is a British historian who I always like to quote because I tend to agree with him, Malcolm Yapp, who you may or may not have heard of. Yapp is now, I don't know if he's still with us, he's definitely retired, but Yapp wrote two, I think, phenomenally good textbooks on the modern Middle East in the late 80s and early 90s. 2 volumes on the emergence of the modern Middle East from the 1790s until the 1980s. And in his first volume on the Middle East, that was until the 90s, written and included the period until the 1920s, Yapp wrote the following: that the understanding of the great powers of the Middle East at the end of World War I, Yapp observed that the Europeans, the British and the French, made errors in their identification of the opposition and greatly overestimated the role of nationalism in it. The Europeans wanted nationalism to be the most prominent element. Nationalism, they understood. It was a modern European doctrine, and those who professed it talked the language of debating chambers. Islam and tribalism, on the other hand, seemed dark and dangerous factors, elemental passions rather than doctrines, and their leaders, if they could be discovered, were hard, uncompromising men. In the Middle East of the late 19th and early 20th century, we have a period of great ideological ferment. This is the era which historians have referred to as the era of Islamic reform. The great works of these intellectual giants, I would say the greatest of all, Muhammad Abdu from Egypt, but people like Afghani and Abdu and Rashid Rida, names I'm sure all the Middle Eastern people here know very well. And in this Islamic reform of the late 19th and early 20th century, there was this very intensive discussion of typically Western ideas of secularism and nationalism. And secularism and nationalism tended to dominate the local intellectual discourse. But in the Middle East, this dawn of nationalism, as opposed to the dawn of nationalism in Europe, was never quite the dusk of religious modes of thought. And rather, the two continued to compete with each other. That is, nationalism and religious modes of thought tended to compete with each other, experiencing different periods of relative success in the marketplace of ideas. And the question I ask is, why was this so? Why was religion and other forms of traditional expression so tenacious, so resilient? And here I want to say a word, this is something I wrote somewhere else, in an effort to define what I mean by tradition. When you say tradition or neo-tradition, what exactly do you mean? So this is what I mean. This is what I call the problematique of definition, but this is how I put it. Traditions themselves are often invented and reinvented. Tradition does not remain the same. So even if people talk about tradition and even claim to espouse tradition, they are not necessarily not engaging in continuous change. Traditions themselves are often invented and reinvented. By the way, read Eric Hobsbawm on the subject. Thus, present-day neo-traditionalism is not simply an unaltered replica of the past. So even if ISIS, for example, speaks in the name of tradition, it may not be the reenactment of tradition, but they speak in the name of. But more often than not, it is itself, this tradition is itself a product of modernity, and an effort to contend with the challenges of the modern world by the mobilization of traditional values, however reinterpreted they may be. The neo-traditionalists differ from the modernists in that the latter, the modernists, are more generally future-oriented than the traditionalists are. And the neo-traditionalists or traditionalists tend to be more past-oriented in their search for answers for the problems and challenges of the present. The neo-traditionalists are not averse to all that modernity has to offer. And the modernists do not reject everything about tradition. But the two are usually situated on very different places on the modernity-tradition continuum. It is not a clear-cut black and white dichotomy, rather a matter of degree. Nonetheless, the degree of difference is significant. And what I'm trying to argue against here is sometimes people tend to use terminology in which you cannot tell black from white. Everything is mushed together as if it were the same. That the tradition is essentially some kind of modernity, and modernity is some kind of tradition. Excuse me, it ain't. There is an overlap here, but they are fundamentally different. And the Muslim Brethren and the generals in Egypt are not the same. And there is a tension, and a real tension, between the modernists who give slight place to tradition and the neo-traditionalists who, even in their approach to modernity, are resting more heavily on the weight of tradition. So how do we explain the resilience? The resilience, I would argue, has 4 reasons. I will list the 4 and then I will explain them briefly, and we'll see how much time we have after that, whether I go on to a little bit more talk about the Arab Spring. First of all, the non-separation of religion and politics. That religion and politics were never really separated at any period of time. except maybe briefly, we could say, in the Turkish Republic, in the aftermath of the Atatürk revolution. Second, the tension between individual rights and group rights. Do people struggle for their rights as individuals or as members of a group? Third, the territorialization of collective identity. This is a typically European idea, that identities are wedded to territory. And like the Middle East acceptance of the idea of statehood altogether is an acceptance of Western-inspired ideas. But what the territorialization of collective identity has done, I would say, much to the detriment of the Ottoman Empire, and I would say in the long run, much to the detriment of the people of the Middle East, is that the moment you link group identity with territorial contiguity, you have the makings of civil war, ethnic cleansing, the genocide of the Armenians. It's bloodshed over and over again. And the fourth point is that the reforms that were instituted over the last 200 years, from Muhammad Ali in Egypt via the Tanzimat of the Ottoman Empire, the reform was always top-down, never bottom-up. The reform was not instituted because of agitation from the bottom, but imposed by modernizing dictators, and not always willingly accepted by the masses of the people. And secularization imposed top-down was not always willingly accepted, and never really entirely successful. So let's begin with the non-separation of religion and politics. The ideal Western type of government of the people, by the people, for the people, as formulated by Abraham Lincoln in the famous Gettysburg Address, that is clearly separating between the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of man, was never fully endorsed in the Middle East, with, as I said before, perhaps the exception of a few decades of Republican Turkey. The Islamic reformers of the late 19th century, going back to these quite, I would say, intellectual heroic figures like Muhammad Abdu, the Islamic reformers of the late 19th century went to great lengths to establish a synthesis between Islam and modern science, between Islam and Western-style progress, and to argue that there was no contradiction between them. But this is problematic. Problematic because the argument that there was no real contradiction between Islamic religion and modern science, and between Islam and the West, allowed the disciples of Abdu and company to interpret their teaching in two diametrically opposite ways. If there was indeed no contradiction between Islam and Western-style modernity, one could argue that Islam was not in need of any far-reaching reform. It already complied with the requirements of Western science and modernity. So that was one vision, which became essentially the vision of people like Rashid Rida and then Hassan el-Banna and the Muslim Brethren. But there was an alternative interpretation. If there was indeed no such contradiction between Islam and the West, then why not adopt Western ways, lock, stock, and barrel? Take it all. Become completely secular and Westernized. And this is the archetype, is one of the greatest intellectuals perhaps that Egypt has ever produced, Ahmed Lutfi al-Said. Ustad al-Jil, as they called him in Egypt, the master or the teacher of a generation, a great believer in secular territorial nationalism, a great believer in Western-style secularism too. So, and he too was a student of Abdu. So you have people like Rashid Rida on the one hand, and people like Ahmed Lutfi Said, on the other hand, interpreting this non-contradiction between Islam and the West in two diametrically opposed ways. And these two diametrically opposed ways continue to be the essence of the struggle between the forces of modernity and tradition. In the 1920s, Egypt's intellectual scene experienced what one historian called the attack upon tradition. The 1920s in Egypt were a time when books were published that criticized the Prophet, that spoke about Egypt in purely secular Egyptian territorial terms. Ali Abdel Razik, Taha Hussein. And this was a very profound intellectual assault on tradition. But at the end of the 1920s, very much in response to this assault on tradition, you have the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. And then in the 1930s, the revival of an Islamist response to this attack upon tradition, the growing influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. Even people like Taha Hussein, writing things very praiseworthy of the Prophet, taking a step back from what they had said in the 1920s. There was a reaction. And the Westernizers and the Islamists have been in fierce competition ever since. And not only in Egypt, it's everywhere. Then you have the radicalization of the Islamist response. The two great ideological contributors to this radicalization were the Pakistani Abu Ala al-Maududi and the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, developing the term that they called the New Jahiliyyah. What is the New Jahiliyyah? The New Jahiliyyah is a revolutionary term. The Jahiliyyah, I'm sure you know, but I'll just say very briefly, the Jahiliyyah is that period of barbarism and ignorance that precedes the appearance of the Prophet and his revelation. That's the Islamic understanding of the pre-Islamic period. The pre-Islamic period is this period of ignorance and barbarism, where people are not aware of the true message, the true revelation of God Almighty brought by Muhammad the Prophet. What Maududi and Qutb are arguing is that the Jahiliyyah is not a period in history that precedes the arrival of the Prophet. The Jahiliyyah is a condition. It's a societal condition of a society which is not governed by the Sharia. This is the New Jahiliyyah. The Muslim states of the 1940s, 50s, 60s and onwards, that they are criticizing these Muslim states for not conducting themselves on the basis of the Sharia and not being Sharia driven. These are Jahili, that is infidel regimes of barbarism, Nizam Kafir, an infidel regime. By the way, there are people in Israel, the ultra-right in Israel, who speak of the Israeli state in exactly the same terms. Nizam Kafir is what the Islamists say about Mubarak and company. There are people in Israel who speak about the state as being Medina Koferet. Medina Koferet, that is a state which is an infidel state, that it doesn't conduct itself. This is the ultra-secular right. That is, the state doesn't conduct itself according to the teachings of the Jewish equivalent of the Sharia, the Halakha. And these Jahili infidel regimes, Maududi and Qutb would argue, must be and should be forcefully overthrown. One need not acquiesce in this kind of Jahili society. This kind of pressure led the modern, more secular regimes to constantly make concessions to the Islamists. And if the Middle Eastern regimes of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s had pushed the Sharia onto the sidelines, marginalized the Sharia both from the legal system and the schools, and virtually excluded it from the Constitution, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, this is all reversed. And religion is allowed back in to the constitutions, the courts, and the school systems. And this is true of Egypt, it's of Syria, Iraq, you name it. There are no countries that were free of this entirely. So that's point number one, the non-separation or the incomplete separation of religion and state. Now we come to the tension between individual rights and group rights. And again, I refer to Malcolm Yap, who speaks of Middle Eastern society as traditionally composed of various groups whose relationship to each other was like that of pieces in a mosaic. Governments recognized the existence of these groups and dealt with them in different ways. This is essentially, the Millet system in its ideal formation. There was no assumption that society was composed of numbers of individuals who should be treated in a uniform fashion. Rather, different groups had different rights and interests and required to be governed in different ways. Society was structured by groups based on birth, family, extended family, tribe, and most importantly, religious sect. People defined themselves by the community, the religious community to which they belonged, not by the language they spoke. Therefore, the Ottoman regime was never perceived by the Arabs, for example, as a colonialist conquest. It was a perfectly legitimate Muslim government. And people saw themselves first and foremost as Muslims, or otherwise, Christians of various denominations, Jews, Alawis, Druze, etc. And the explosion of the Arab Spring had far more to do with individual economic grievances and hopelessness than with individual civil rights. The fact that the Egyptians could oust a democratically elected Islamist government through the massive support for a military coup is hardly the promotion of individual civil rights as top priority. There are other priorities. And the other priorities are mainly dealing with the economic hopelessness that this entire generation faces. Neither the popularly elected Muslim Brotherhood regime of President Mohammed Morsi, nor the regime of Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who came to power on the wings of a widely supported coup d'etat, had individual civil rights as a high priority on their respective agendas. If anything, the very popular Sisi regime was more brutally repressive of opponents of all stripes, religious and secular, than his Islamist predecessor. The struggle between the two was never mainly about individual civil rights, but about the identity of the Egyptian collective. Is the Egyptian collective more or less secular, more or less Islamist? That is, more or less modernist or more or less neo-traditionalist. The struggle is over the power, prestige, and prosperity of Egypt and the Egyptians as a collective. In Iraq, following the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003 by the United States, the US expectation was that the people of Iraq, as individuals, would organize in a pluralist democratic party system, Western style. But instead, the respective religious groups, Sunnis and Shiis, entered into conflict with each other as groups. And this was about the relative rights of the groups within the framework of this Iraqi state, even to the point of breaking the state up. In Syria, the Arab Spring was probably in its initial phase an outburst of opposition which apparently began because of individual grievances of peasants in the periphery who were having a terrible time, which was a result of drought and the poorly managed economy of the Syrian state. But this economic grievance developed in no time into a horrific sectarian civil war. And it's the ruling Alawites against the rest. I'm sure the Middle Eastern people here, I'm sure, have heard of the name Sadiq al-Azam. Just recently, August 2014, Sadiq al-Azam wrote an article in the Boston Review, and it's called Syria in Revolt, Understanding the Unthinkable War. And Sadiq al-Azam explains how the evolution of this renewed sectarianism has gripped Syrian society at its very core, something, a good read. Libya and Yemen are both extreme examples of tribal and or sectarian conflict that are threatening to tear these countries apart. So much about the individual and the group. The third, the territorialization of collective identity. Like the state itself, this was a European notion that was fully absorbed into the Middle Eastern discourse and into Middle Eastern societies. This linkage, and for the most part, quite disastrous linkage between community and territorial contiguity. European westernizing ideas haven't always served the peoples of the Middle East well. In the traditional Ottoman order, and one may say what one may like about the traditional Ottoman order, but in the traditional Ottoman order, communities lived side by side, for the most part, peacefully, throughout the empire, almost with no regard for territorial contiguity. There were various communities interspersed in this kind of mosaic, puzzle-like form throughout the empire, whether this be the Balkans or in the Arab-speaking parts of the empire, pretty much the same. But with the momentum of nationalism, the idea that communities or nations inhabited spaces of their own gained widespread currency. The Tanzimat introduced a reform of great historical importance, the principle of equality before the law. That is, people were no longer governed by their own community legal systems. That is, the Muslims by the Sharia and the Christians by their own churches and the Jews by their halakha, etc. Equality before the law. Everybody was now governed by the same law, which meant essentially the territorialization of the legal system. It meant that everybody in the Ottoman Empire, under the sovereign territory of the Ottoman Empire, was now under the same legal system. At least theoretically, that was to be so. And with the application of this new principle of equality, the law for the first time applied to all subjects throughout the territory under Ottoman control. And this gave rise to new forms of collective identity. And what the Ottomans tried to do was to create an Ottoman identity, and which was an Ottomanism that they tried to promote, but it failed. And Ottomanism, however, never met with the kind of success they had hoped for, and was soon succeeded by Turkish nationalism and other nationalisms that aspired to link community with language and contiguous territory. Thus, the Balkan nations, the Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgars, and others, instead of becoming equal under the law as Ottoman subjects, preferred equality in countries of their own and broke away from the empire. The Turkish-speaking Muslims were left with the heartland of the empire, with Anatolia, as their prospective homeland. And they were thus soon to come into conflict with the Armenians, who lived throughout Anatolia in their dispersed communities, particularly in the east, but elsewhere too. And the Turks and the Armenians sought self-determination in the same stretch of Anatolia. And the conflict of interest eventually culminated in the Armenian genocide in the midst of World War I. And this same problem of territorialized identity led to the Turkish-Greek population exchange of 1923 and to many other ethnic conflicts throughout the Ottoman lands, from the Greek-Turkish conflict in Cyprus to the wars of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans of the 1990s, and the sectarian struggles of the present in Syria and Iraq, which similarly include numerous instances of communal welfare and at times even ethnic cleansing, like the Alawis now kicking out Syrians, Sunnis from the Alawi territory in northwest Syria. And when the central governments in the Arab states were all powerful, instilling the fear of government in their peoples, they could maintain the territorial integrity of these communally divergent states. But that is no longer true. In countries like Iraq or Syria, Libya or Yemen, that possess neither powerful central governments nor consensual social contracts that could effectively maintain the territorial cohesion of these states. And this is exactly what ISIS has come to supplant and to represent the breakup through sectarian politics. And in the ISIS case, the Sunni Muslim desire to create some kind of Sunni Muslim dominated state in what were the countries of Iraq and Syria. By the way, there's this confusion of what ISIS's name is. IS or ISIS or ISIL comes from the lack of knowledge of the Arabic language. And it has to do with what Bilad al-Sham means. Bilad al-Sham is Greater Syria. And what ISIS calls itself is al-Dawla al-Islamiyya fi al-Iraq wa Bilad al-Sham. Or wa Sham. Fi al-Iraq wa Sham. Oh, that's, right, but it's al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, but the original name was Daesh. And therefore, how do you translate Asham? So the translation was Syria, and therefore ISIS. Then they decided that Asham is not really Syria, it's the Levant. And so it became ISIL. But the thrust of the idea here is this challenge to the European-created state order by this new emergence of sectarian territorialism. And the fourth point is reform from the top down rather than from the bottom up. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, Western-style modernizing reforms were introduced in the various countries of the Middle East, from the reforms of Muhammad Ali in Egypt and the Tanzimat in the rest of the empire, to the reforms of Ataturk in Turkey or Gamal Abdel Nasser and the other offer regimes in the Arab states of the mid-20th century. And these reforms were all introduced top down and not bottom up. They were never introduced in the wake of popular agitation. Quite the contrary. And having been imposed from above, they were often imposed on unwilling and uncooperative populations. And secularization, therefore, never went very deep in Middle Eastern societies. Asif Bayat, who has written a lot about religion and state in the Middle East, came up with a term which he calls, in one word, he says, secular religious. And he described Egypt as a secular religious state. Secular religious is, say, one long word with one R in the middle. A fitting epithet, I would say, for other Arab countries too. And just a word on the Turkish case. Ataturk never really thrust his reforms through to the rural population of Anatolia. If in the aftermath of the Second World War, Turkey underwent an amazingly extensive process of urbanization. The villagers in their tens of millions migrated from the villages to the cities. And it is they who brought the tradition and traditionalism from the villages back to the cities, not the other way around. The westernizing cities may have aspired to secularize the countryside, but that is not exactly what transpired. And thus, the capacity of people like Erdogan initially to get elected as the mayor of Istanbul. And then from there to become the prime minister and then the president of Turkey. And these societies, for the most part, are going through a prolonged phase of socio-economic distress. And as I said, hopelessness. And it is therefore hardly surprising that many of the people in these societies tend to seek the comforting and familiar embrace of neo-traditionalism. And I will end my remarks there and gladly take your questions in the time that we have. So